Welcome to the Historyden YouTube channel. This is the 9th video in the Ancient Greek series. So all the previous videos we've done on Greece, we finally come to one of the most important events in Greek history, the Greco Persian Wars. The Greco Persian Wars are one of the most famous wars in all of military history. It was fought in the 5th century BC between the seemingly endless Persian Empire and a collection of independent Greek cities. This was truly a David and Goliath matchup. The Greeks had a much smaller population and treasury in comparison to the Persian war machine. And also, the Persians had never lost a single battle. They were essentially undefeated until they met the Greeks. The Persians had a very different government. They brought with them a palace-based government that was ruled by a nobility that eventually answered to one man, the great king. This style of government ran counter to the independent and free Greek city-states. The free Greek world would decide matters by a majority vote, not by a perpetual ruler. Greek freedom and independence was at stake, and the future of Western civilization. Now, each Greek city in ancient times wanted to be top dog. The people always wanted to have their way and did not want anybody to tell them what to do. And they could care less if you were the baddest dude on the block, as the Persians would find out. Persia, after a series of conquests, pushed up to the borders of mainland Greece. Initially, they were on friendly terms with the Greeks, but it was only a matter of time before the two sides came into conflict. The Persians were the 800-pound gorilla, confident of victory and in their mass hordes. Because of their reputation, many cities in Asia were taken by the Persians even without a fight. The Persians would soon discover the Greeks were a different fighting caliber than anything they had previously faced. The Greeks valued their military more than anything else. It would not be pushed into submission by any army or any king. The conflict went on for a half a century, if you can think of that. I mean, World War II only lasted 6 years. This would go on for 50 years, between roughly 499 and 449 BC. And during that period, there were times of war and some times where it was relatively calm. And there are two essential phases to the Greco-Persian Wars. The first phase we'll be covering now involves all the events leading up to it and then concluding with the titanic Battle of Marathon. So this was truly a world war that spanned 2 continents. I don't think anything was seen like this in ancient times. The only thing you might compare this to was the Roman Punic Wars. But had the Greeks not defeated the Persians, there's a good chance Rome would never have existed. So the very future of Western civilization was at stake. And even more profound, the future of democracy was at stake. So let's take a look at the situation report in 500 BC, right at the turn of the century. If you take a look at that map below, you can see the Persian Empire expanding near Greece in orange. And you can see that they've gained control of all of the Greeks in Asia Minor, and they've also started to push their way into northern Greece, into Thrace. Meanwhile, in Athens, the Cleisthenes Revolution has taken place. So we have this brand new democracy that has finally occurred in Athens. But there's trouble in paradise, and the Spartans are not happy that the tyranny has been overthrown. And therefore, the Athenians fear the Spartans will come back and restore the tyranny. So Athens is in a very precarious position because of the threat of the Spartans. So as a result, they go to the Persians and ask for an alliance. Now the great king says, okay, we can have an alliance, but you have to give me the symbol of earth and water before any business can be done. But there's one difference here. The great king doesn't understand an alliance in terms of Greek terms. The only thing he understands is total submission. And this is something the Athenians would not accept. In fact, they're outraged and reject this completely. So as it ends up, there is no relationship between Persia and Athens until the Athenians give that all-important symbol of earth and water. And as a result of all of this, the Athenians are on their own against the Spartans. So the Spartans invade Attica in 500 BC, along with Thebes, who's to the north here in Boeotia, and the Corinthians, who are part of the Peloponnesian League. But the Athenians are pretty lucky here. And usually that word luck is very important. What happens is the Corinthians start balking because they don't want to install a tyranny in Athens, because the Corinthians themselves have had great problems with tyrannies. And under that form of government, there were many persecutions. So the Corinthians are not anxious to install the same type of government in Athens. And so they leave the coalition. And so 1/3 of the coalition is already out of the picture. Then another interesting thing happens. The two Spartan kings begin arguing over what to do with Athens. Demaratus favors leaving the Athenians alone, which is kind of always the conservative approach with the Spartans. They really don't like to get involved in the foreign affairs of other city-states. They would rather keep track of what's going on in their local neighborhood. Now, the other Spartan king, Cleomenes, favors reinstalling the tyranny into Athens. So there's this big argument between the two kings. Demaratus loses that argument and he flees with the Persian king. And you'll notice this in Greek history. Anytime a politician falls out of favor in their city, they always seem to go to the Persian king and are always at the Persian king's elbow giving him advice one way or the other. But the result of all this division in Sparta is there is no invasion of Attica. And so Thebes is the only one left to fight the Athenians. And as a result, Athens easily defeats Thebes. And what do the Athenians do? Well, they establish a colony of 4,000 in Boeotia to kind of simmer things down. That's what they always seem to do in ancient times, by the way. The victors will install their own colonies. Now, I put colony in quotes. These are not really settlers. These are more like soldiers to keep the order. Now, after the Athenian defeat of Thebes, the Spartans get restless again, and they're very worried about this thing called democracy spreading. Remember, democracy in those times was very, very foreign to the rest of the city-states around the world. Most either had a tyranny or a great king like Persia. And who do the Spartans want to restore to the tyranny? None other than Hippias. Now, if you remember, Hippias is a tyrant who was thrown out of Athens by the revolution, and that put Cleisthenes in charge to put forward the democracy. But Hippias has also fled to the Persians, and the Persians also want to restore him. So you have both Persia and Sparta wanting to restore Hippias to the throne, but for their own different reasons, so they can both control him. And especially Persia. They want Athens to be their own satrapy in the Persian Empire under the control of their point man, Hippias. Now, the Athenians are going to try to end all of this before it starts, so they send yet another mission to Persia. But this time, there's no asking the Athenians anything. They demand the symbol of earth and water from the Athenians and order them to restore Hippias to the throne. And if all of that had happened, Athens would have become like the Greek cities on the Ionian coast. So that's the situation right before 499 BC. So in 499, we come to the Ionian Rebellion, and this is generally regarded as the start of the Greco Persian Wars. Now, the capital of all the Ionian Greek cities on the coastline of Asia Minor is a city called Miletus. Now, we always hear about Athens and that being the birthplace of philosophy, and we know about the great philosophers of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but it's really in Miletus where this revolution starts. And they attempt to put aside religious concepts and replace them with pure observation and reason. So they divorce the two. That is, they don't let religious concepts corrupt what they see in the real world. So this is really the birthplace of philosophy. And it is here where the Ionian Rebellion starts. The leader of the city is a guy named Aristagoras. Aristagoras has talked the great king into attacking a Greek city island named Naxos, and he wants to make them part of the empire. Naxos, however, receives word of the attack and had time to prepare for it and defeated the siege by the Persians as the Persians ran out of supplies, because this was a complicated amphibious assault and the Persians simply weren't used to that. And because Aristagoras had been the main person convincing the king to attack Naxos, he would be held responsible for its utter failure. So Aristagoras knew he was in deep trouble. So now he plays the role of double agent almost and decides he's going to convince the rest of the Ionian cities in Asia Minor to rebel against the Persians. And what do? They establish Athenian-style democracies. Now, I think it's easy to understand why they take up Athenian democracy. The Athenians and the Ionians were very close cousins in terms of their culture, and they had a very close personal bond with all of the Greek-speaking peoples in Asia Minor. In fact, the Athenians were kind of the de facto leader of all of the Ionian Greek cities. So Aristagoras goes on a mission in mainland Greece and tries to recruit as many city-states as he can to his cause, because he knows he's going to need every available soldier to fight the mighty Persians. And who do you need when you need a land army? You go to Sparta. But King Cleomenes refuses to help because the Spartans once again don't want to have their army outside of the Peloponnesus for too long because they fear a Helot rebellion And Argos, as always, is stirring up trouble. So after Aristagoras is refused by Sparta, he travels to Athens. Now, Athens is going to be a little bit more receptive. As I said, for all intents and purposes, they are an Ionian city. And so they didn't want to see their close relatives destroyed by the Persians. They also had a lot at stake in terms of the spread of democracy and didn't want to see the Persians ending that form of government. And the Athenians also only needed to look at a map to see they would be next on the hit list of the Persians, as well as the fact that many of their shipping trade routes were in Asia Minor. Ever since the time of Solon, their trade from the sea had been increasing, so they didn't want that threatened. So it should come as no surprise that the Athenian Assembly voted to assist Miletus, and they sent a fleet of 20 triremes to Miletus. After the Athenians land on the coast of Asia Minor, they marched with their Ionian brothers and reached the capital of Sardis, which was the capital city of Lydia, and where the satrap was for the Persians. Now, they take the city and set fire and burn it down to the ground, and then they basically took off. This was a terrible blow to the Persians in the area, and there was no doubt they were going to seek revenge first against the Ionians, and then eventually punish Athens. But it wasn't easy. It took the Persians 5 long years, if you can imagine that, 5 years to get back all of Ionia. So basically from 499 BC all the way to 494 BC. And their tactic is to surround the cities on land with their huge armies and then defeat the Greek allied navy at sea. And that combined effect would cut off the Ionians from all of their supply routes. And that's exactly what happened. And eventually the Ionians lose all hope and are forced back into the Persian Empire. The final blow comes at the Battle of Lade, in which the Persians destroy the Greek allied navy, and that essentially ends the rebellion. And as punishment, the Persians take Miletus and burn it to the ground in the same manner in which Sardis had been burned to the ground. Now that the Persians had put down the Ionians, they turned their attention to Athens. And Herodotus relates this nice little charming story, but not so charming for the Athenians. Apparently, he asked for a bow and then shot an arrow into the air and said, "Grant, O God, may I punish these Athenians." So yeah, it didn't look too good for Athens. So by the time 493 rolls around, Athens realizes its turn is next. So they had every right to fear a massive invasion from the Persians. And the guy they turn to is a man named Miltiades. Now, Miltiades had a previous relationship with the great king of Persia. A few years earlier, Miltiades' Greek city had been under the domain of the Persians. So, in a sense, he was a general in the Persian army. And when the Persians ventured into modern-day Russia, Miltiades committed treason by destroying all the bridgeheads, thinking the Persians would never return from a place like that. But to Miltiades' shock, the Persians did return, and so he was somewhat of an outlaw. Now, previous to this, Miltiades had been in Athens and had been exiled from Athens. And that's why he had joined the Persians. But now that he was so anti-Persian, he was welcomed back in Athens. Now, even in Athens, the idea of taking on Persia alone must have seemed insane. As I mentioned earlier, the Persians hadn't lost a single battle and now had their foot into northern Greece. So it didn't look good for the Athenians. And not surprisingly, there were 2 factions in Athens. One that was anti-Persian and another that was pro-Persian and were willing to accept Hippias back as tyrant. And after Miltiades returns, he is brought to trial for being a tyrant in another area in Greece, the area in Greece that had been under Persian sway. But he was found innocent. And again, all of this occurs in 493. And I think he was found innocent because the Athenians were trying to send a statement that they were definitely anti-Persian. Now, also during this time, Themistocles, along with Miltiades, is elected archon. Now, Themistocles is a guy we'll hear from later during the Battle of Salamis. So in 492, the great king assembles his army and starts down the Aegean coast. And the person in charge of this contingent is Mardonius. And we'll also hear from him later on as well. So they march along the Aegean coast instead of taking a more direct route across the sea. They conquer Thrace and Macedon and look poised to strike into southern Greece near Athens. But then, as luck would have it, one of those terrible Aegean storms wipes out the entire Persian fleet off the coastline of Mount Athos. Now at this point, Mardonius has little choice but to abandon his invasion of Greece. And for the moment, Athens is saved. Now, interestingly, during the second phase of the Persian Wars, this is the same exact route that Xerxes will take during his major invasion, but we'll get to that later. Still, this is a bad situation for Greece, as many Greek cities decide to go ahead and give the earth and water sacrifice to the Persians. By this time, the Spartans themselves are getting very nervous and decide to go ahead and form an alliance with Athens to counter a common enemy in the Persians. So, with many of the Greek city-states capitulating to the Persians, the Persian Emperor Darius decides to make one last attempt to persuade Athens and Sparta to give the Persian symbol of surrender, which of course is earth and water. And the response from Athens and Sparta could not have been any clearer. Athens tossed the envoys into a pit. The Spartans did the same, pushing them into a well. And according to Herodotus, they were told if they wanted earth and water for their king, those were the places where to get them from. So there would be no surrender and no retreat. So with that, the Persians began to plan for another war. And once again, they depart in 490 towards the Greek mainland. But this time, they're going to take the shortest route possible, and they move across the sea as opposed to marching along the Aegean coast. Now, the Persians aren't just seeking revenge, they're also seeking to set up a base of operations in Greece. And what better place to do that than in Athens, as Athens overlooks the entire Aegean Sea and would be a great port for the Persian Navy. So as they move across the Aegean Sea, they're going to go on this whirlwind tour and stop at several Greek islands. First, they arrive at Naxos. Now, if you remember, Naxos had held out against a lengthy Persian siege and eventually repelled the Persians. Well, this time the Persians come back and are successful and totally destroy that city. Then they head to Delos, and they actually treat the Delians quite nicely, as opposed to what they did to the Naxians. And they even allowed the Delians to continue practicing their worship of the Greek gods. And of course, this is different than the Persians, who are sun worshippers and have an entire different set of gods. So the message here the Persians are sending is they're not at war with all of the Greeks, just a few of the cities like Sparta and Athens. So as this island hopping tour continues, they arrive at the coastal town of Carystus, which is on the island of Euboea and is very close to Attica. But the inhabitants of Carystus refuse to pay homage to the Persians, and the city is obliterated from the face of the earth. Next up is Eretria. Now, Eretria had assisted Athens earlier in the burning of Sardis during the Ionian rebellion. And so the Persians have no choice but to seek revenge, and this city is also destroyed. Now, interestingly, there were 4,000 Athenians here. If you remember, that was the colony that the Athenians had formed after they defeated Thebes. Well, these guys decided to get out of Dodge and head back to Athens for the coming fight against Persia. So at this point, the Persians are poised to invade Athens, and the spot they decide to pick is Marathon, which will become burned in the memory of every Greek and every Persian for all time. So in August of 490, the Persians finally land at the plain of Marathon. They bring with them about 25,000 infantry and, most importantly, 1,000 cavalry. The Athenians can field about 10,000 hoplite warriors with no cavalry on the wings. Now, there are a couple reasons why the Persians chose Marathon. First, it's a good place for cavalry, and the Persians always preferred to fight on open plains because their numbers alone could be decisive. And the other reason is the Persians were accompanied by Hippias. Yep, the tyrant has returned. And making this more compelling was that he was from the area around Marathon. This was his homeland. So Hippias and the Persians were probably hoping the people would rise up in this area and fight for him. So there's that possibility that's out there, that people might start defecting to the Persian side. So the Persians are holding out for a revolution in Athens that would see Hippias again take over in sort of a bloodless coup. Now at this point, the Athenians realize this whole thing's going down really quickly, and they need to get help from their newest ally, Sparta. So they dispatch this runner to Sparta, and he spends a legendary 2 days running all the way from Athens to Sparta. And of course, this is where the modern event Marathon gets its name from. But the Spartans can't send their army until this religious ceremony that they are participating in is over. And that means they are not allowed to leave until the next full moon, a whole week after the Persians have landed. But I doubt the Spartans were trying to deny the Athenians here. They really did take religion very, very seriously. So when the Athenians back in Athens receive the news that the Spartans will be a week late, they have two options at this point. One is to keep the army pinned down in Athens and defend the city itself, and the other is to go out and block the Persians on the coast of Marathon. The problem with the first plan is it would allow the Persians to enter the Attican countryside, and that would have given the Persians free rein to do anything they wanted. And here is where Miltiades emerges as the leading figure. He convinces the Athenians they have to pin down the Persians on the Marathon beach. And of course, Miltiades is the resident Persian expert, having been a general in their army. And in his own right, he himself is a great general, as he will prove at Marathon. So he is the de facto leader, even though there is a rotating command between 10 generals. Miltiades' plan also makes sense in that there was an inherent danger that if they waited in the city, the supporters of Hippias might gain momentum by the delays. And this also went against the Greek ethic that you don't stand down in the face of an enemy that is ravaging your lands. You must show courage and get out there and fight rather than hide behind your walls. That just completely went against the Greek ideal of courage and bravery. So Miltiades' plan is finally accepted. So when the Athenians arrive in Marathon, they block the road that would allow the Persians to either go to Athens or descend into the plain of Marathon proper. So now the Persians are basically pinned down on the beach. There's also a marsh to the right of the Persians that will play a key role later in the battle that we'll discuss. And so both sides now wait, and they sit there for several days. What are they waiting for? Well, the Persians are probably sitting there waiting for the revolt that never really comes, and Miltiades is holding out as long as he can for the Spartans to arrive, because after all, he's still outnumbered at least 3-1. Now, several days later, the Persians finally break the stalemate and took about 10,000 of their forces and cavalry and put them back on the boats and sailed around the Cape towards Athens. Now Miltiades has a big-time problem, because his entire army is in the plain of Marathon. And if that Persian task force arrives outside of Athens, there'll be nobody there to defend the city. So finally he gives the signal to advance. And apparently all he said was, "at them," according to Herodotus. Now, even though the Persians split their forces, Miltiades was still outnumbered by about 5,000 troops. So he has to deal with that. And the way he deals with that is to weaken his center and increase the size of the flanks. He also has the upper hand in that he's got the high ground, and the Persians are below and will have to go up a hill to take on the Athenians. So everything depended on that weakened center holding the main Persian thrust until the Athenians could rout the flanks and then crash in on the Persian center. And that's exactly what happens, but just barely. And what I mean there is the Persians, as Miltiades expected, were routing the Athenian center. And it was just about to break when at the last moment, the Athenians defeated the Persians on both the right and left flank and then crashed in on the center. At this point, the Persians broke ranks and started to head back to their ships, but that swamp blocked their retreat and many Persians were cut down in the process of falling back. The Athenians didn't have a long time to celebrate, though, because they had to deal with that task force that was off to Athens. So they split up their army, and several Athenian regiments hightailed it back to Athens. At this point, the Persian task force was shocked to see that there was an Athenian army in front of the gates of Athens, and they were forced to turn back. This was an enormous victory for not just Athens, but all of Greece as well. Amazingly, only 192 Greeks died during the battle, while several thousand Persians were slaughtered. And true to their word, the Spartans arrived the next day, and they toured the battlefield to see the Persian dead. So it's an enormous victory for the Greeks. This was the first time the Persians had been defeated. It also showed the absolute superiority of hoplite warfare. The heavily armored Athenians were no match for the lightly armored Persians. It was also a victory for democracy. Still, the defeat at Marathon barely touched the vast resources of the Persian Empire. And the Persians would not give up easily. They would start planning for another major invasion that both the Spartans and Athenians would have to deal with. But for the moment, the Greeks could celebrate. They had broken this idea that the Persian army was invincible. And in a much larger sense, this allowed democracy and Western civilization to flourish. Had the Athenians lost here, we might have seen the end of Western civilization, and the world which we live in today would be a very different place. That's it for this video. I will see you guys in the next video, where we will talk about the second part of the Persian Wars.